In the shadowed annals of the Viking Age, spanning from the late 8th to the 11th century, the northern seas carried warriors whose exploits reshaped the landscapes of Europe, from the rugged coasts of Scandinavia to the fertile river valleys of England, Ireland, and beyond. These seafarers, often romanticized in later sagas as bold explorers, were in truth participants in a complex web of trade, settlement, and conflict, where the accumulation of wealth through raids became a defining feature of their society. Among the most enigmatic remnants of this era are the buried hoards, collections of silver, gold, jewels, and artifacts interred beneath the earth, often in remote fields, bogs, or near ancient settlements. These treasures, unearthed centuries later by chance or through the patient sweep of metal detectors, offer glimpses into the turbulent lives of those who concealed them, revealing not just material riches but echoes of the violence, uncertainty, and mortality that permeated Viking existence. The act of burial itself speaks to a world where fortunes could be won in a single bloody incursion but lost just as swiftly in the chaos of battle or the perils of travel, leaving behind caches that whisper of unclaimed legacies and forgotten fates. Consider the Galloway Hoard, discovered in 2014 inches the pastoral lowlands of southwestern Scotland, a region once caught in the cross-currents of Viking influence and Anglo-Saxon resilience. Here, on land belonging to the Church of Scotland near the village of Balmagee, a metal detectorist named Derek McLennan stumbled upon what would prove to be one of the most significant archaeological finds of the century. At first, his device signaled a silver arm ring, its surface etched with intricate patterns reminiscent of the Saltire cross, a design blending Scandinavian craftsmanship with local motifs. As excavations deepened, layer upon layer unfolded, revealing over 100 objects of astonishing variety: silver ingots and arm rings, gold bird-shaped pins, rock crystal vessels wrapped in silk from distant Byzantine looms, and even a lidded silver vessel traced back to the Sasanian Empire in what is now Iran. This vessel, adorned with Zoroastrian fire altar imagery and containing compacted earth flecked with gold, perhaps mementos from pilgrimages to the Holy Land, had journeyed across continents before finding its resting place around 900 AD. The hoard's composition defies simple categorization, mingling Viking bullion with Anglo-Saxon brooches inscribed in runes that spell out names like Egbert and Edward, suggesting a communal deposit where multiple individuals contributed their shares, bound by oaths or necessity, in a time when alliances were fragile and enmities deadly. The burial of such a hoard in Galloway, a frontier zone between the Viking-controlled Irish Sea and the remnants of Northumbrian kingdoms, invites reflection on the darker undercurrents of its origins. This was an era when Viking longships sliced through coastal waters, descending upon monasteries and towns with calculated ferocity. The infamous raid on Lindisfarne in 793 AD, often marked as the dawn of the Viking Age, saw Norse warriors plunder the sacred treasures of that holy island, carrying away silver chalices, jeweled reliquaries, and coins that would later circulate in Scandinavian markets or be melted into ingots for trade. Similar assaults echoed across Europe, the sacking of Iona in Scotland multiple times between 795 and 806, where monks were slain or enslaved, their illuminated manuscripts torn apart for the gold leaf within, or the prolonged siege of Paris in 845, led by figures like Ragnar Lothbrok in legend, though historically by a chieftain named Reginherus, resulting in vast ransoms paid in silver to avert further destruction. The items in the Galloway Hoard, including a silver pectoral cross engraved with symbols of the four evangelists, likely once belonging to a high-ranking cleric, bear silent witness to such predations, possibly looted from ecclesiastical sites in Ireland or England, where Viking raiders targeted the unprotected wealth of the church, leaving trails of devastation that reshaped religious and political boundaries. Yet the mystery deepens when considering why these treasures were consigned to the ground. Historical accounts and archaeological evidence suggest that Vikings buried hoards for safekeeping amid the perpetual threats of counter-raids or internal strife. In a society without formal banks, the earth served as a vault where a warrior might inter his gains before embarking on another voyage, intending to reclaim them upon return. But many such deposits remained undisturbed, implying that their owners met untimely ends, perhaps cut down in the melee of battles like the clash at Stamford Bridge in 1066, where Norwegian king Harald Hardrada fell, or lost at sea during treacherous crossings of the North Atlantic. The Galloway Hoard's layered structure, with a superficial deposit of less valuable silver, perhaps meant as a decoy, hints at deliberate deception, as if the buriers anticipated pursuit or betrayal. Runes on the arm rings, recently deciphered to include phrases suggesting "this is the community's wealth," point to a collective effort, maybe by a group of Anglo-Saxon locals or mixed Viking settlers pooling resources in the face of impending danger from rival clans or invading forces. The region's history during the 9th century was one of shifting powers. Viking settlers from Dublin establishing footholds, clashing with Pictish and Gaelic communities, and engaging in slave trading that funneled captives and their possessions back to Scandinavia. Death lurked in these interactions, from skirmishes over fertile lands to the ritual executions described in sagas, where enemies were subjected to the blood eagle, their ribs carved open in a grim display of dominance. Turning northward to the island of Gotland in the Baltic Sea, another trove illuminates the breadth of Viking economic entanglements and the shadows they cast. The Spillings Hoard, unearthed in 1999 on a farm in the parish of Spillings, stands as the largest Viking silver cache ever found, comprising over 14,000 coins, primarily Islamic dirhams from the Abbasid Caliphate, alongside arm rings, bracelets and ingots totaling nearly 150 pounds of metal. Discovered beneath the floor of an ancient building, this hoard was likely buried around 870 AD, a time when Gotland served as a pivotal trading hub, its merchants facilitating exchanges between the Rus's principalities in the east and the western Viking realms. The coins, many fragmented into hacksilver for weight-based transactions, trace routes through the Volga and Dnieper rivers, where Viking traders known as Varangians bartered furs, amber, and slaves for Arabian silver, often amid perilous journeys fraught with ambushes by nomadic tribes or rival merchants. The sheer volume of the Spillings find suggests accumulation through both commerce and coercion, as raids on Byzantine territories or Persian caravans supplemented peaceful trade, blending prosperity with the peril of violent acquisition. The dark secrets embedded in such hoards extend to the human costs they represent. Each ingot or coin could embody the spoils of a raid, like the assault on the monastery at Noirmoutier in France in 835, where Vikings repeatedly returned to extract tribute, leaving communities terrorized and depleted. Burials like Spillings might have been prompted by local unrest. Archaeological surveys around the site reveal evidence of fortified settlements and battle scars on nearby bones, indicating that Gotland, despite its trading wealth, was not immune to the feuds that plagued Viking society. Sagas recount chieftains like Eric the Red, who fled Norway after killings, carrying portable wealth that could be hidden if needed. In this context, the non-retrieval of hoards speaks to mortality's grip. A trader slain in a dispute over shares, a raider felled by an arrow in a foreign land, their knowledge of the burial site dying with them. Theories from medieval texts, such as the Saga of the Inglings, propose that some hoards were offerings to Odin or Thor, buried to appease gods in exchange for victory or safe passage, a practice rooted in pagan beliefs where the underworld claimed what was given, intertwining spiritual devotion with the practicalities of a warrior's life marked by constant threat. Across the Irish Sea, the Galloway Hoard, found in 1840 along the banks of the River Ribble in Lancashire, England, further unveils the intricate ties between raiding and concealed riches. Labourers repairing an embankment unearthed a lead-lined chest containing over 8,600 items, including 7,000 coins from diverse mints, Anglo-Saxon, Carolingian, Byzantine, and even from the distant Samanid Emirate, along with ingots, jewelry fragments, and artifacts like Pictish combs and Irish penannular brooches. Dated to around 905 to 910 AD, this massive deposit, the largest Viking hoard in the British Isles, likely stemmed from the expulsion of Vikings from Dublin in 902, when Norse settlers, defeated by Irish kings, fled to northwest England with their plunder. The chest's contents reflect a mosaic of conquests: coins minted under Alfred the Great, who fortified his kingdom against Viking incursions, mingled with those from the Danelaw, the Scandinavian-held territories where laws and customs blended in uneasy coexistence. The burial at Quairdale evokes the desperation of displacement, as these exiles, perhaps under leaders like Ingimundr mentioned in Irish annals, sought temporary refuge while plotting reconquest. Historical records detail the violence of this period, the burning of villages, the enslavement of populations, and pitched battles like the one at Tettenhall in 910, where Viking forces were decimated, their king slain. Burying such wealth could have been a precaution against betrayal within their own ranks or attacks from Anglo-Saxon militias, with the river's edge chosen for its landmark qualities, easy to remember but hard to detect. Yet the hoard remained hidden, suggesting its owners perished in subsequent conflicts, their deaths sealing the treasure's fate. This pattern recurs in other finds, like the Hohen Hoard in Norway, discovered in 1,834 inches of bog, containing gold coins, beads and jewelry from the 9th century, possibly an offering or a chieftain's cash buried before a fatal voyage. Sagas describe how figures like Harald Fairhair unified Norway through campaigns that displaced rivals, forcing them to conceal assets amid flight. As we delve deeper into these subterranean archives, the Nørremølle Hoard from Bornholm, Denmark, adds another layer to the narrative of peril and preservation. Found in 2006 near a burned Viking settlement, it included 1,194 coins from across Europe and the Near East, silver jewelry and iron tools, all stashed in a ceramic vessel around 980 AD. The site's charred remains post holes, pits filled with charcoal point to destruction by fire, likely during an attack, where inhabitants hurriedly buried their valuables before fleeing or facing their end. Bornholm, strategically positioned in the Baltic, was a crossroads for trade but also a target for Slavic raiders or internal Scandinavian disputes, as evidenced by fortified ring forts like Trelleborg built to counter such threats. The Hoard's international coins underscore the Viking world's global reach, acquired through ventures like the Varangian Guards service in Byzantium, where Norse mercenaries earned gold but often met violent deaths in imperial wars. Burying treasures in such contexts was a hedge against uncertainty, yet the failure to recover them highlights the era's lethality. Diseases on longships, drownings in storms, or the swing of an axe in ambush, even in death rituals, hoards played a role. Ship burials like that at Oseberg in Norway included riches for the afterlife, blending pagan eschatology with the material spoils of life. These practices reveal a culture where wealth was both a marker of status and a fragile possession, shadowed by the constant spectre of loss. Shifting to the Vale of York Hoard, uncovered in 2007 inches North Yorkshire, England, we encounter a silver-gilt Frankish vessel packed with 617 coins, arm rings, and ingots, buried around 927 AD amid King Athelstan's campaigns to unify England. This period saw the fall of Viking York, with Norse rulers like Sigtryg Kaish fleeing or submitting, their treasuries potentially hidden in haste. The vessel, possibly looted from a Carolingian church, encapsulates the fusion of sacred and profane in Viking acquisitions, where relics from raided abbeys became currency in a bullion economy. The hoard's location in the former Danelaw, a zone of hybrid culture born from invasion, speaks to the human toll of colonization. Displaced Anglo-Saxons, enslaved Celts, and Viking settlers intermarrying amid ongoing skirmishes. Theories suggest the burier was a Viking noble escaping Athelstan's advance, only to perish without revealing the site, leaving behind artifacts that narrate a story of ambition curtailed by mortality. In the Huxley Hoard from Cheshire, found in 2004, silver arm rings dated to 900 AD likely belonged to Vikings ousted from Ireland, buried near lead mines that symbolized the region's economic allure. This find, wrapped in lead from a box, evokes the makeshift measures taken during retreats, with the owners perhaps falling in the Battle of Brunanburh in 937, a cataclysmic clash that solidified Anglo-Saxon dominance. These hoards collectively paint a portrait of the Viking Age, not as mere adventure, but as a tapestry woven with threads of gain and grief, where buried treasures stand as monuments to the unnumbered dead whose stories dissolved into the soil. The persistent theme that emerges from these buried collections is one of interrupted continuity, where the decision to conceal wealth often marked the final act in a life abruptly curtailed. In the Viking worldview shaped by cycles of raiding, trading, and seasonal returns to farmsteads, the possession of portable riches carried both promise and peril. Silver, in particular, functioned as a universal currency across vast distances, weighed rather than counted, its value determined by purity and mass rather than any centralized authority. This bullion economy, evident in the fragmentation of coins and jewelry into hack silver, allowed for fluid transactions but also necessitated constant vigilance. A successful raid on a Frankish monastery might yield chalices hammered flat into ingots within days, their ecclesiastical origins erased to fit the pragmatic needs of exchange. Yet, the very abundance that such raids produced could invite envy or outright violence from companions, neighbors, or enemies, compelling the prudent to seek hidden places beneath thresholds, in hollow trees, under cairns, or simply in unmarked earth far from habitation. The Galloway Hoard illustrates this vulnerability with particular clarity. Its discovery in 1840 occurred during railway construction along the Ribble, when workmen uncovered a decayed wooden box reinforced with lead, its contents spilling out in a glittering cascade that astonished even the hardened labourers of industrial Lancashire. The hoard's date, pinned to the early 10th century through numismatic analysis, aligns closely with the expulsion of the Norse from Dublin following defeats inflicted by the combined forces of Leinster and Munster kings. Irish annals, such as those compiled in the Annals of Ulster, record the event starkly. The foreigners were driven overseas after a great slaughter, their departure marked by the abandonment of long-held strongholds. Many of these exiles crossed to the Wirral and other coastal enclaves in northwest England, areas already dotted with Scandinavian place names and burial sites. The sheer scale of the Galloway deposit, more than 36 kilograms of silver, suggests it represented the accumulated wealth of an entire group rather than an individual, perhaps a chieftain's war chest or a merchant collective's reserve. That it was never retrieved implies catastrophe. Perhaps the party was overtaken during their flight inland, ambushed by local Anglo-Saxon levies or rival Norse factions vying for control of the newly arrived resources. Skeletal remains from contemporary battlefields in the region, though sparse, show evidence of violent trauma skull fractures, severed limbs, consistent with the swift and merciless engagements that characterized this transitional period. Further east, the Vale of York Hoard, concealed around the year 927, captures another moment of political upheaval. At that time, the Viking Kingdom of York, under rulers of the Ivarsan dynasty, faced mounting pressure from the expanding West Saxon realm of Athelstan. The king's campaign to bring the north under unified rule culminated in the submission of several Scandinavian leaders, yet resistance simmered, and hoards like this one likely reflect the hurried actions of those who foresaw defeat or exile. The silver-gilt cup that contained the treasure, a finely wrought Frankish vessel probably taken from a Carolingian church during earlier raids into Francia, had been repurposed as a container, its liturgical elegance now serving a secular, survivalist purpose. Inside lay Anglo-Saxon pennies minted as far afield as Wessex and Mercia, alongside dirhams from the Islamic world and fragments of arm rings bearing Scandinavian decorative styles. This cosmopolitan mix mirrors the far-reaching network sustained by Viking activity. Trade routes that stretched from the Baltic to Baghdad, from Dublin to Kiev, sustained by both peaceful barter and predatory extraction. The burial site, near a Roman road that remained in use, offered a recognizable landmark for later recovery. Yet the knowledge perished with its depositors, perhaps in the turmoil surrounding Athelstan's consolidation of power or in the subsequent battles that punctuated the 10th century. Across the water in Scandinavia itself, hoards buried in less overtly contested landscapes still carry undertones of unease. The Galloway Hoard, recovered from a peat bog in Buskerud, Norway, in 1834, contained gold objects of exceptional quality, bracteates stamped with runic inscriptions, filigree pendants, and coins from the Byzantine Empire and the Carolingian domains. Dated to the mid-9th century, this collection likely belonged to a person of high status, possibly a woman given the prevalence of jewelry, though gender attributions in Viking archaeology remain cautious. The choice of a bog as a hiding place evokes older sacrificial traditions, where valuable items were offered to supernatural forces inhabiting watery places. Yet practical considerations cannot be dismissed. Bogs preserved objects remarkably well, and their soft, trackless surfaces made detection difficult. Whether the Galloway deposit was a votive offering, a precautionary cache before a journey, or the result of a death that left no heirs to reclaim it, the absence of retrieval points to the same underlying fragility: lives cut short by disease, accident, or conflict in an age where mortality struck without warning. The act of burial, then, often served as a final assertion of control in a world defined by unpredictability, Sagas preserved in 13th century Icelandic manuscripts, though written long after the events they describe, frequently mention hidden wealth. In the saga of Grettir the Strong, the outlaw buries treasure before his demise, intending it for his kin, only for the location to be lost amid his isolation. Such tales, while literary, draw on real practices documented in archaeological contexts. The Spillings Hoard on Gotland, with its overwhelming quantity of Eastern silver, reflects the risks inherent in long-distance trade. Gotland's position made it a natural entrepot, yet its openness to the sea invited raids from Slavic groups along the southern Baltic coast, or from rival Scandinavian factions. The hoard's burial beneath the dwelling floor suggests an attempt at concealment within the household, perhaps during a period of local tension. Excavations around the find site have uncovered traces of ironworking, animal bones, and structural remains that indicate a prosperous farmstead, yet the treasure's scale far exceeds what a single household might accumulate through agriculture alone. It points instead to active participation in the eastern trade routes, journeys that carried Norse traders through the rivers of Rus to the markets of the Khazar Khaganate and the Abbasid Caliphate. These expeditions were lucrative but hazardous. Byzantine chronicles record Varangian attacks on Constantinople in 860 and 907, while Arab geographers like Ibn Fadlan describe the Rus as fierce traders who doubled as raiders, their silver dirhams flowing westward in exchange for furs, wax, and human captives. The human dimension of these journeys emerges in fragments: a runic inscription on a Gotland picture stone depicting a ship under sail, or the skeletal evidence from mass graves in places like Repton, England, where Viking winter camps left behind disarticulated remains bearing signs of battle wounds and execution-style injuries. Such violence was not confined to distant lands. Internal feuds within Scandinavia could erupt over inheritance, land disputes, or perceived slights, prompting the concealment of movable wealth. The Nørremølle Hoard on Bornholm, buried in the late 10th century, was found within the ruins of a settlement destroyed by fire. Charred timbers and ash layers suggest deliberate arson, possibly during a raid or punitive expedition. The hoard itself, placed in a pot and covered hastily, included Byzantine miliaresia alongside Western deniers, testifying to the continued flow of Eastern silver even as the Viking Age drew toward its close. Bornholm's strategic importance as a stepping stone in Baltic navigation made it a frequent target, and the failure to recover the treasure likely stems from the death or displacement of its owners in the conflagration. These examples collectively reveal a pattern. Hoards were not mere repositories of wealth but artifacts of contingency. Their burial marked moments of acute anxiety, imminent attack, forced migration, terminal illness, or sudden death, while their non-recovery speaks to the finality of those moments. In a society where oral transmission of knowledge was paramount, the loss of the individual who knew the hiding place equated to permanent loss. Runestones from the same period, erected as memorials, sometimes mention inheritance or property, yet rarely reference concealed hoards, suggesting that such matters were kept secret even from kin to prevent theft. The Galloway Hoard, with its remarkable array of objects spanning centuries and continents, encapsulates this complexity most vividly. The silk-wrapped crystal from the Carolingian world, the Sasanian bowl bearing traces of pilgrimage soil, the pectoral cross of probable Irish origin, all converged in a single deposit in 9th century Scotland. Their presence implies a collector or group of collectors whose lives intersected with the major currents of the age: ecclesiastical plunder, long-distance trade, perhaps even diplomatic exchanges between Viking settlers and Christian rulers. That such diversity was consigned to the earth underscores the precariousness of possession in an era defined by motion and conflict. The convergence of objects in hoards like Galloway also prompts consideration of the individuals who handled them across their long journeys. A silver arm ring, its surface worn smooth by repeated wear, might have passed from the wrist of a Frankish noble killed in a raid near the Seine to the pouch of a Norse warrior returning to Dublin, then to the hands of a trader in York before being buried in a Scottish field. Each transition carried the risk of violence or betrayal, and the final act of burial often represented an attempt to interrupt that chain of possession, to protect what had been so hard won. In many cases, the hoards contain items that show signs of deliberate fragmentation: coins cut into halves or quarters, jewelry broken into manageable pieces. This practice of hack silver was not mere vandalism, but a practical adaptation to a world without standardized coinage, where weight and silver content determined value. Yet the act of breaking beautiful objects, arm rings twisted into spirals, brooches snapped apart, carries its own quiet melancholy, transforming heirlooms or sacred vessels into raw commodity. The Galloway pectoral cross, for instance, once a symbol of clerical authority, had been carefully dismantled, its arms separated, perhaps to facilitate weighing or to erase its religious significance in a pagan context. Such treatment reflects the pragmatic mindset of those who acquired these items through force or commerce, yet it also hints at the cultural dislocations experienced by both raiders and raided. Archaeological evidence from settlement sites across the Viking world reinforces this picture of precarious existence. At Ribe in Denmark, one of the earliest urban centers in Scandinavia, excavations have uncovered workshops producing glass beads, amber jewelry, and iron tools, all destined for export. Nearby, small hoards of silver and bronze have been found beneath house floors, suggesting that even in relatively stable trading towns, individuals felt the need to conceal portions of their wealth. The presence of Islamic dirhams alongside local Scandinavian ornaments in these deposits points to the Eastern connections that sustained the economy, routes that required months of travel through hostile territories. Travelers faced not only natural hazard storms on the Baltic, ice on the rivers, but human ones, tolls exacted by Slavic chieftains, ambushes by steppe nomads, or rival merchant groups. The failure rate of such expeditions must have been high, and each unrecovered hoard stands as indirect testimony to those who did not return. Chronicles from the Byzantine court, such as the writings of Constantine Porphyrogenitus in the mid-10th century, describe the Rus traders arriving annually with their wares, heavily armed and suspicious, conducting business under strict supervision to prevent violence. These accounts, though written from an outsider perspective, capture the tension that accompanied even ostensibly peaceful exchange. In England, the distribution of hoards maps closely onto the areas of heaviest Viking settlement and conflict. The Danelaw, the region ceded to Scandinavian control under treaties like that of 878 between Alfred and Guthrum, contains a disproportionate number of finds, from small personal caches to massive communal deposits like Querdale. This pattern suggests that the act of burial became more frequent in zones of contested authority, where shifts in power could render yesterday's ally tomorrow's enemy. The Repton mass grave, excavated in the 1980s, provides a stark human counterpoint. The remains of at least 264 individuals, mostly young males, buried in a charnel pit during the winter camp of the Great Heathen Army in 873–874. Many skeletons show old healed injuries alongside fresh wounds, indicating lives marked by repeated combat. Isotope analysis of teeth reveals that some originated in Scandinavia, others from the British Isles, suggesting a mixed force drawn together by opportunity and coercion. Such gatherings, while militarily formidable, were internally volatile. Disputes over division of plunder could turn deadly, prompting individuals to hide their shares before tensions erupted. The proximity of several hoards to known Viking winter quarters, Repton, Torksey, Aldborough, supports the idea that burial often occurred in haste during periods of occupation or withdrawal. The role of women in this world of concealed wealth deserves attention, though the evidence remains fragmentary and interpretive. Grave finds across Scandinavia include women buried with keys, chests, and jewelry, symbols of household authority and portable property. In hoards, female-associated objects appear regularly: beads, pendants, oval brooches. The Hohen Hoard, with its abundance of gold jewelry, has long been linked hypothetically to a high-status woman, perhaps the wife or daughter of a chieftain who died without male heirs to inherit or reclaim the treasure. Sagas occasionally describe women managing household finances, concealing valuables during raids, or even participating in trade. Ord the Deep-Minded, a figure in the Laxdala saga, is said to have brought considerable wealth to Iceland, including chests of silver during the settlement period. While literary, such accounts draw on a reality in which women controlled movable property to a degree unusual in many contemporary European societies. The burial of hoards may therefore sometimes reflect female agency in moments of crisis, hiding family wealth when men were absent on voyages or slain in battle, only for the knowledge to be lost when the women themselves perished from disease, childbirth complications, or the same violence that claimed their kin. As the Viking Age progressed into the 10th and 11th centuries, the nature of hoards began to shift subtly. Fewer massive deposits appear after around 950, coinciding with the gradual Christianization of Scandinavia and the consolidation of royal power under figures like Harald Bluetooth in Denmark and Olaf Tryggvason in Norway. Larger kingdoms meant greater internal stability, formalized taxation, and the emergence of mints producing local coinage. Yet older patterns persisted in peripheral regions. On the Isle of Man, part of the Irish Sea Viking sphere, several hoards from the late 10th and early 11th centuries contain a mix of Anglo-Saxon, Hiberno-Scandinavian, and continental coins, buried during periods of instability following the decline of the Dublin kingdom. The Kirk Michael Hoard, discovered in 1834, included over 300 coins alongside arm rings and ingots, concealed around 1025 during a time when man served as a base for raiding expeditions into Wales and England. The non-recovery of such caches again points to disruption, perhaps the death of their owners in the campaigns of Canute the Great, whose conquest of England in 1016 drew heavily on Scandinavian manpower, or in the subsequent struggles for control of the Irish sea routes. Even as political landscapes changed, the impulse to bury wealth in times of uncertainty endured. The Scale Hoard from Orkney, found in 1858 on the Bay of Scale, contained silver arm rings, ingots and coins from Ireland, England and the continent, buried around 951,000. Orkney, settled by Norse incomers in the 8th and 9th centuries, remained a semi-autonomous earldom well into the medieval period, its inhabitants caught between loyalty to Norwegian kings and the practicalities of local lordship. Hoards here reflect both the wealth generated by control of Atlantic trade routes and the persistent threat of raids from Irish or Scottish Gaelic groups. The act of burial in such remote islands, often near coastal settlements, suggests an awareness that escape by sea might not always be possible. These later hoards, while smaller in scale than those from the 9th century, still carry the same echoes of mortality and interruption. The earth continued to serve as a reluctant archive, preserving what human hands had placed there in hope or fear. Each find, when carefully excavated and studied, adds nuance to our understanding of a period defined not only by bold voyages and dramatic battles, but by quieter, more personal calculations. When to hide, what to conceal, and whether there would ever be a chance to return. The treasures that remain speak most eloquently of those who never did. The persistence of hoarding practices, even into the Christianizing centuries of Scandinavia, reveals how deeply ingrained the instinct for concealment had become. By the late 10th century, kings like Harald Bluetooth had begun to centralize authority, erecting massive circular fortresses at places such as Trelleborg, Fierkat, Nonnebakken, and Aggersborg, structures designed not only for defense, but also to project royal power over previously semi-autonomous chieftains. These ring forts, with their precisely laid streets and barracks, housed large garrisons and served as administrative nodes where tribute could be collected and redistributed. In such an environment, the need to bury personal wealth might have diminished for those aligned with the emerging state. Yet hoards continue to appear, often in rural settings, far from these new centers of control. The small but carefully selected caches found near farmsteads on Zealand or in Jutland, containing a handful of coins, a few arm rings, perhaps a Thor's hammer pendant, suggest that ordinary free farmers or minor landholders still felt the same vulnerability that had driven their forebears to hide their gains. The transition to Christianity, marked by the erection of runestones bearing crosses alongside older pagan symbols, did not erase the memory of a time when power rested in the hands of individual warriors and families rather than crowned monarchs. Burial remained a private act, one that expressed distrust in the permanence of any social order, whether pagan or Christian. The economic underpinnings of this behavior deserve closer examination. Viking society operated on a bullion-based system long after many neighboring regions had adopted struck coinage with fixed values. Silver arrived primarily through two channels: the Eastern silver trade, which peaked in the 9th and early 10th centuries before declining as Islamic mints reduced output, and the Western tribute payments exacted from Frankish, Anglo-Saxon, and Irish rulers. Chronicles such as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle record repeated Danegeld's large sums paid to buy off Viking armies, amounting to tens of thousands of pounds of silver over the course of the 10th and early 11th centuries. These payments, often in the form of newly minted coins, entered Scandinavian hands either as loot or as negotiated tribute, then circulated as bullion. The fragmentation seen in so many hoards reflects the constant breaking and reweighing required for everyday transactions. A merchant in Birka or Hedeby might clip a coin to make exact payment, melt down jewelry to cast ingots of standard weight, or simply hack apart larger pieces to match the scales used at market stalls. This process, while eminently practical, also rendered beautiful objects utilitarian, stripping them of their original meaning and reducing sacred or artistic items to their metallic content. The emotional weight of such transformation lingers in the archaeological record. A once ornate Irish chalice reduced to shapeless lumps, a Byzantine solidus sliced neatly in half, its imperial portrait divided between two future transactions. The human stories that lie behind these acts of fragmentation and concealment surface only indirectly through the careful study of associated finds and contextual evidence. At Ballandry Crannog in Ireland, a Viking Age site occupied in the 10th century, excavations revealed silver arm rings and ingots buried beneath the floorboards of a dwelling, alongside everyday domestic items, spindle whorls, bone combs, iron tools. The Crannog, an artificial island reached by a causeway, offered a measure of security against land-based attack, yet the decision to hide valuables within the home suggests that even here, in a defended settlement, trust was limited. Irish annals describe Viking activity in this period as a mix of raiding and settlement, with Norse-Gaelic hybrid communities emerging along the coasts. The Galloway Hoard, small in comparison to Quairdale or Spillings, likely belonged to a resident of middling status, a trader, a ship's captain, or a farmer with ties to the sea who buried his savings before departing on a voyage or during a period of local unrest. That the hoard was never retrieved implies that the owner did not survive to return, perhaps lost to shipwreck on the Irish Sea, felled in a skirmish with Gaelic neighbours, or carried off by disease during one of the periodic epidemics that swept through crowded coastal settlements. Similar patterns appear in the Scottish Isles, where Norse settlement left a lasting imprint on place names, language, and material culture. The Store Hoard from the Isle of Lewis, discovered in 2017, consisted of silver arm rings and ingots buried around the year 1000, a time when the Kingdom of the Isles was taking shape under Norse Gaelic rulers. The burial site, near the dramatic rock formations of the Trotternish Peninsula, offered natural concealment amid a landscape of cliffs and moorland. The arm rings, many bearing the characteristic broad-band decoration of Hiberno-Scandinavian craftsmanship, reflect the fusion of Viking and Celtic artistic traditions that characterized this maritime zone. Their interment may have coincided with the turbulent succession disputes that followed the death of Sigurd the Stout, Earl of Orkney, whose campaigns extended Norse influence into northern Scotland and Ireland. The failure to recover the hoard again points to sudden disruption, perhaps the death of its owner in battle, or his departure as part of a larger migration or military expedition from which he never returned. Even in the heartlands of Scandinavia, where political consolidation advanced most rapidly, hoards testify to lingering uncertainty. The Viking Hoard, found near Stockholm in 2017, contained over 200 silver coins, mostly Anglo-Saxon pennies from the reigns of Ethelred the Unready and Canute, alongside arm rings and fragments of jewelry. Buried around 1000 and 1030, during the period when Canute ruled both England and Denmark, the hoard reflects the flow of wealth northward as a result of conquest and tribute. Yet its location beneath the floor of what appears to have been a modest dwelling suggests it belonged not to a great magnate, but to someone of more ordinary means, perhaps a returned mercenary or a trader who had profited from the Danish presence in England. The decision to bury such wealth, even under the rule of a strong king, indicates that personal security remained fragile, subject to the same risks of theft, feud, or sudden death that had prompted earlier generations to hide their possessions. As the Viking Age faded into the medieval period, the practice of hoarding silver did not vanish entirely but became less frequent and less dramatic. The establishment of royal mints in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden produced coinage that circulated within more stable borders, reducing reliance on foreign bullion. Church building and the endowment of monasteries absorbed wealth that might once have been buried, channeling it instead into visible monuments of faith. Yet the memory of earlier practices lingered in folklore and legal texts. Medieval Icelandic laws, codified in the 12th and 13th centuries, include provisions concerning found treasure rules about dividing it between finder and landowner or returning it to heirs if the original owner could be identified. These clauses suggest that old hoards continued to surface long after their deposition, prompting disputes that echoed the original circumstances of concealment. The treasures that have come to light in modern times through the chance stroke of a plough, the sweep of a detectorist coil, or the systematic excavation of threatened sites thus form an unintended archive of a vanished world. Each hoard, whether vast or modest, carries within it the imprint of lives lived under constant contingency. The silver that once changed hands amid the clamour of markets, the clash of weapons, or the quiet negotiations of kinship now rests in museum cases, cleaned and catalogued, its journey interrupted forever by the same uncertainty that prompted its burial. In studying these objects, we do not merely recover wealth long lost. We recover fragments of human experience, the fear of loss, the hope of return, the reality of finality that shaped an era defined as much by its hidden things as by its visible deeds. The interplay between hoarding and the broader rhythms of Viking life, seasonal voyages, agricultural cycles, kinship obligations further illuminates why so many treasures remained in the ground. Raiding seasons typically aligned with the warmer months, when seas were calmer and fields could be left in the care of those who stayed behind. Returning warriors brought silver, captives, and prestige goods, but the following winter often brought scarcity, disease, and the settling of old scores. A successful summer might yield enough wealth to sustain a household through lean times or to fund another expedition, yet that same wealth could make its owner a target. Feuds, documented in sagas and occasionally corroborated by archaeological evidence of violent deaths, could flare over division of spoils or perceived dishonor. In such circumstances, bearing a portion of silver became an act of prudence, a way to safeguard resources against theft by rivals or even by kin who might press claims under customary law. The law codes later recorded in Iceland and Norway, though compiled centuries after the Viking Age, preserve traces of these tensions: provisions for oath, taking to prove ownership of found goods, penalties for wrongful concealment, and rules governing the inheritance of movable property when a person died without heirs present to claim it. These legal echoes suggest that the non-recovery of hoards was not always accidental, but sometimes the outcome of deliberate secrecy that outlasted its purpose. The physical act of burial itself varied widely, reflecting both practical necessity and cultural habit. Some hoards were placed in simple pits lined with cloth or leather to protect against moisture. Others rested inside containers, wooden boxes, ceramic pots, lead-lined chests, even repurposed vessels like the Sasanian bowl in the Galloway find. The choice of location often exploited natural features: the root ball of a fallen tree, a distinctive boulder, the bank of a stream whose course might serve as a mnemonic aid. In wetland environments, bogs and marshes preserved organic materials remarkably well, which is why finds like the Viking Hoard or the earlier Tolland man, though not Viking, demonstrate the preservative power of anaerobic conditions. Yet this same preservation could betray the depositor's intent. A hoard sunk into peat might have been meant as an offering rather than a cache, given to the gods or spirits of the place in exchange for favor. Distinguishing between votive deposits and hidden savings remains one of the more subtle challenges in Viking archaeology. Runestones from the 11th century sometimes mention gifts to the gods or memorials that include property dispositions, but explicit references to buried treasure are rare, perhaps because such matters were considered too sensitive for public inscription. The Galloway Hoard, with its extraordinary range of objects, continues to reward close study for what it reveals about cross-cultural contact and the movement of people as well as things. The silk fragments wrapped around the rock crystal vessel point to connections with the Byzantine world or the Islamic caliphates, where such textiles were produced in state-controlled workshops. Silk was a prestige good in Scandinavia, appearing in high-status graves and mentioned in sagas as a mark of wealth. Its presence in a hoard buried in 9th century Scotland suggests that the objects travelled not in a straight line, but through multiple hands, perhaps carried by merchants along the river routes of Rus, traded in Constantinople or Baghdad, then acquired by Vikings serving in Varangian units or by raiders who struck Byzantine coastal towns. The small lead weights and scales found in many Viking Age sites, including trading centres like Birka and Hedeby, indicate that such exotic items were appraised by weight, their value detached from any original cultural context. The Galloway pectoral cross, stripped of its chain and carefully separated, may have been taken from an Irish or Scottish monastery during one of the repeated raids on Iona, Dunkeld, or other ecclesiastical sites in the 9th century. Annals record the burning of Iona in 806, with 68 monks slain, an event that sent shockwaves through the Christian communities of the British Isles. Reliquaries and crosses from such places often entered Viking circulation, either melted down or preserved as bullion until circumstances demanded their concealment. The layered structure of the Galloway deposit, deeper, more valuable items covered by a superficial layer of silver arm rings, has prompted suggestions of a decoy strategy, a tactic known from other periods and cultures facing the threat of plunder. Whether the buriers anticipated immediate pursuit or simply followed a customary practice of misdirection, the arrangement speaks to a calculated awareness of risk. The runic inscriptions on several objects, including one that may read, "This is the community's wealth," imply collective ownership rather than individual possession. In Viking society, wealth was frequently held in partnership among ship crews, kin groups, or trading associations bound by oaths sworn before departure. If one partner died or defaulted, the others might bury the shared assets until disputes could be resolved. The failure to reclaim the hoard could thus result from the death of all parties to the agreement, perhaps during a subsequent raid or in the course of migration to new lands. Similar communal dimensions appear in the Viking Hoard, whose contents suggest contributions from multiple sources: Anglo-Saxon coins minted under different kings, Frankish deniers, Samanid dirhams, Irish jewelry, and Scandinavian-style arm rings. The lead chest that contained them had been reinforced, perhaps to withstand travel, yet was buried rather than carried further. This moment of deposition likely occurred in the aftermath of the 902 expulsion from Dublin, when Norse Gaelic groups scattered across the Irish Sea. Some settled in the Isle of Man, others in the Hebrides, still others in northwest England, where place names like Formby and Crosby preserved their linguistic imprint. The Ribble Valley, where the hoard lay, offered fertile land and access to both the Irish Sea and overland routes into Yorkshire. Burying the chest, there may have been a temporary measure intended for recovery once the immediate crisis passed. That it remained untouched for a millennium suggests the intended recipients never returned, killed in battle, carried into slavery, lost at sea, or simply unable to locate the site amid changing landscapes and shifting memories. The Spillings Hoard on Gotland, with its predominance of Eastern silver, similarly reflects communal effort. Gotland's farmers and traders operated in networks that extended far beyond the island, pooling resources for expeditions that could last years. The hoard's location beneath a house floor, rather than in open ground, implies an attempt at domestic concealment, perhaps during a period of local instability. Gotland experienced several episodes of unrest in the Viking Age, including possible conflicts with mainland Swedish powers or raids by Baltic Slavs. The sheer quantity of silver enough to equip and provision several longships indicates wealth accumulated over time, perhaps through multiple voyages. Its burial around 870 coincides roughly with the decline in Eastern silver inflows documented in coin hoards across Scandinavia, a shift that prompted some traders to redirect their efforts westward. The non-recovery of Spillings may mark the end of one such network, its members dispersed or dead before the hoard could be divided. Across these examples, a common thread emerges. The hoards are not anomalies, but symptoms of a society in which wealth was both mobile and mortal. Silver changed hands rapidly, carried on ships, traded in markets, divided among crews, hidden from rivals, offered to gods, or buried against future need. Each burial captured a pause in that flow, a moment when someone, whether warrior, trader, farmer, or woman managing a household, judged the risk of carrying or displaying wealth to outweigh the risk of losing it to the earth.
That so many poses became permanent speaks to the precariousness of life in an age of long voyages, sudden violence, and uncertain returns. The treasures themselves, now cleaned, weighed, photographed, and displayed, no longer serve their original purposes. Instead, they bear witness to the human calculations and calamities that placed them there, preserving in metal the quiet aftermath of lives that ended without retrieval. The gradual shift from building hoards to more structured forms of wealth storage in the later Viking Age and early medieval Scandinavia mirrors broader transformations in society and economy. as Christianity took firmer root first through the conversion of kings like Harald Bluetooth, whose javelin stones proclaimed Denmark's baptism around 965, then through the missionary efforts of figures like Ansgar earlier in the 9th century and Olaf Tryggvason at the turn of the millennium. New institutions emerged to receive and safeguard riches, monasteries and cathedrals endowed with land, relics, and precious metals offered an alternative to the earth as a place of deposit. Church inventories from the 11th and 12th centuries list chalices, crosiers, reliquaries, and altar cloths donated by laypeople, including former Viking families, now integrated into Christian nobility. These gifts served multiple purposes: spiritual merit, social prestige, and a measure of security against the instability that had once prompted private burial. Yet the transition was uneven. In rural districts, far from episcopal oversight, older habits lingered. Small hoards from the 11th century, often containing a mix of old foreign coins and newly minted Scandinavian issues, appear in fields and house foundations, suggesting that some individuals continue to trust soil over sanctuary when local feuds or royal taxation loomed. The archaeological visibility of these later hoards tends to be lower, partly because fewer massive deposits were made and partly because coin hoards from this transitional period are more likely to have been recovered in antiquity by their owners or heirs. Those that remained hidden often reflect moments of acute crisis, the civil wars that punctuated the reigns of his successors in Denmark and Norway, the disruptions caused by Swedish expansion eastward, or the pressures of taxation imposed by increasingly centralized monarchies. The Harthugnet hoard from Denmark, though small, contained English pennies from the 1040s, buried during a period when Danish rule over England faltered and internal strife erupted. Such finds, modest in scale, nonetheless carry the same implication of interrupted intention. Silver placed in the ground with the expectation of return, an expectation unfulfilled because the depositor's life ended sooner than anticipated. Being Scandinavia, in the regions shaped by Viking settlement, hoarding practices adapted to local conditions while retaining core elements of the original impulse. In Normandy, where Rollo's grant of land in 911 marked the beginning of a settled Norse duchy, hoards from the 10th century are rare, reflecting the rapid integration of Viking settlers into Frankish structures of land tenure and ecclesiastical patronage. The dukes of Normandy endowed monasteries lavishly, channeling wealth into visible architecture rather than concealed caches. Yet occasional finds such as the small deposit of silver coins and jewelry from the early 11th century near Rennes suggest that even in this more stable environment, portable wealth retained its allure as a private reserve. In the Scottish Isles and Ireland, where Norse influence persisted longest, hoards from the 11th and 12th centuries often contain Hiberno-Scandinavian ring money, distinctive broadband rings that served as currency, and Anglo-Norman coins buried during periods of conflict between Gaelic kings, Norse earls, and incoming Anglo-Norman forces after 1169. The Derrick hoard from County Antrim, discovered in the 19th century, included silver objects and coins from the late 11th century, concealed perhaps during the turbulence surrounding the rise of the nail or the campaigns of Magnus Relics of Norway. These later examples illustrate how the Viking Age tradition of burial evolved rather than disappeared. The underlying motivations need to protect movable wealth in a world where political authority remained contested, where travel was hazardous, and where sudden death was commonplace persisted across generations. Even as written records became more abundant and legal mechanisms for inheritance more formalized, the impulse to hide valuables in moments of uncertainty endured. Medieval chronicles and churches occasionally mention discoveries of ancient treasure, treated as windfalls to be claimed by lord or church, a practice that echoes the legal provisions found in Icelandic law codes.
Such finds, when they occurred, must have recalled older stories of warriors and traders who never returned to reclaim what they had entrusted to the earth. In reflecting on the full corpus of Viking Age hoards, from the monumental Spillings and Quairdale deposits to the modest personal caches found beneath house floors or in remote bogs, one is struck by their cumulative testimony to human fragility. Each object within them, whether a hacked fragment of an Abbasid dirham, a filigree pendant from a Frankish workshop, an Irish brooch bent into bullion, or a runic inscribed arm ring, carries the trace of its journey. Forged in one land, looted or traded in another, carried across seas, divided among companions, hidden in haste. The act of burial arrested that motion, fixing the object in place while the world continued its turns of season, war, and migration. That so many such arrests proved permanent is less a matter of chance than a reflection of the era's essential conditions. Lives conducted at the edge of survival, where every voyage might be the last, every raid might end in slaughter, every winter might bring famine or fever. The treasures themselves, now removed from their earthen contexts and placed in museum vitrines under controlled light, have been transformed once more. They no longer serve as currency, status symbols, offerings, or emergency reserves. Instead, they function as historical documents, mute witnesses to the interplay of violence and exchange that characterized the Viking Age. Through careful analysis, metallurgical study of alloys, isotopic tracing of silver sources, typological comparison of decorative styles, numismatic dating of coins, scholars reconstruct the paths those objects traveled and the circumstances that led to their concealment. Yet the most poignant dimension remains stubbornly human and irretrievable. The precise moment when someone knelt in soil or peat, placed their wealth in the ground, covered it, and walked away believing they would one day return. That belief, repeated across centuries and landscapes, failed more often than it succeeded. The hoards that survive are the residue of those failures, preserved not by design but by the very mortality they were meant to outlast. In this sense, the buried treasures of the Viking Age are not merely collections of metal and stone, they are fragments of lives suspended, of plans unfulfilled, of deaths that arrived without warning. They remind us that behind every gleaming ingot and every intricately worked brooch lies a story of acquisition through courage, cunning, or coercion, and of loss through the simplest and most universal of causes, the inability to come back. As we trace the paths of these objects from distant mints and raided monasteries to hidden pits and modern display cases, we encounter not just the material culture of a past era, but the quiet, persistent shadow of its human cost. The dark secrets they hide are not tales of monsters or curses, but of ordinary ambition and ordinary endings of people who gathered wealth against the future, only to have the future arrive on different terms than they expected. The enduring presence of hoards across the Viking world, even as political and religious landscapes shifted, underscores a fundamental continuity in human behavior amid change. Wealth, once acquired through the hazards of sea and sword, retained its character as something fragile and fugitive. No amount of royal proclamation, church consecration, or legal codification could fully displace the instinct to place valuables beyond immediate reach when danger loomed. In the final decades of the Viking Age, as Scandinavian kingdoms coalesced and their rulers turned from raiding to governance, the scale of hoarding diminished, yet its logic remained intact. A farmer in Uppland or a merchant in Trøndelag might still bury a small handful of silver pennies beneath the hearthstone before departing for the annual Thing assembly, where disputes over land or honor could turn violent. The same caution that had prompted 9th century raiders to conceal their plunder now guided 10th and 11th century landholders wary of royal tax collectors, ambitious neighbors, or the unpredictable outcomes of inheritance claims pressed by distant kin. Archaeological patterns from this later period reveal hoards that are often more localized in origin, containing predominantly Scandinavian or Anglo-Scandinavian issues rather than the cosmopolitan mix of earlier deposits. The decline in Eastern silver inflows after the mid-10th century caused by political instability in the caliphates, the redirection of trade routes, and the exhaustion of accessible mines meant that Western sources, particularly the large Danegeld payments extracted from England, became the primary influx. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records payments under Ethelred the Unready, totaling tens of thousands of pounds of silver between 991 and 1016, sums that entered Scandinavian circulation through tribute, ransom or pluna. Coins bearing the names of English mints London, York, Lincoln, Chester appear in hoards across Denmark, Sweden and Norway, often buried in the decades following Canute's conquest of England in 1016. These later finds, while smaller than the giant of the 9th century, still speak to the same contingencies. A returned mercenary hiding his share before a feud erupted, a widow concealing family silver during a period of uncertainty, a trader stashing gains before embarking on a final voyage across the Baltic or North Sea. One such example is the small hoard from Tingstad on Gotland, discovered in the early 20th century, containing silver coins from England, Denmark and Germany, buried around 1040–1050. Its modest size and domestic context, a pit near a farmstead contrasts sharply with the vast Spillings deposit from the same island 2 centuries earlier, yet the impulse behind its concealment appears unchanged. Gotland, though increasingly tied to the Swedish crown, remained a place where local autonomy and maritime connections preserved older patterns of behavior. The coins, many clipped and worn from circulation, reflect everyday use rather than spectacular acquisition, suggesting that even routine prosperity carried its own risks in a world where fire, theft, or sudden death could erase years of careful accumulation. In Norway, hoards from the reigns of Olaf Haraldsson, St. Olaf, and his successors show a similar trend towards smaller, more personal deposits. The silver economy persisted alongside emerging monetary systems, and the practice of burial continued in rural areas where central authority was still distant. A hoard from Ringerike, found in the 1990s, contained Norwegian pennies alongside a few English issues, concealed around 1030 during the turbulent years following Olaf's death at Stiklestad in 1030. The battle itself, remembered in skaldic verse and later sagas, left many warriors dead and their followers scattered. Survivors who had carried wealth from earlier campaigns or from service in England might have hidden it before fleeing or facing new rulers. That some such caches remained unclaimed points to the enduring reality of violent disruption even under nominally unified kingship. The Irish Sea Zone, where Norse influence lingered longest, provides some of the latest Viking Age hoards. On the Isle of Man, deposits from the mid-11th to early 12th centuries include ring money and cut coinage, buried during a period when the kingdom oscillated between independence, Norwegian overlordship, and pressure from Anglo-Norman, England and Gaelic Ireland. The Glenfaber hoard, discovered in 2003, contained over 200 pieces of silver arm rings, ingots, fragments dated to around 1000 and 31,040. Its burial coincides with the reign of Earl Godred Crovan, whose rule was marked by military campaigns and shifting alliances. Concealment in such a context may reflect anticipation of invasion, internal revolt, or the simple precaution of a household preparing for absence or attack. The hoard's location, near a stream in a valley, suggests a site chosen for its accessibility yet relative seclusion, a compromise between ease of memory and difficulty of discovery. These late hoards, though fewer in number and less spectacular in scale, complete a long arc that began with the first major deposits of the late 8th century. From the massive communal caches of the raiding heyday to the modest personal savings of the Christianizing centuries, the practice of burial traces, the evolution of a society from one defined by mobility and predation to one increasingly rooted in land, law, and faith, yet never entirely free of the fear that what had been gained might be lost. The earth remained a silent partner in that process, receiving treasures when no other sanctuary seemed certain. In the centuries that followed, the hoards that had lain undisturbed gradually entered the historical record through chance discovery. Ploughmen in the 18th and 19th centuries turned up silver in fields across Britain, Ireland and Scandinavia. Antiquarians and early archaeologists catalogued them with varying degrees of care. The Cuerdale hoard, unearthed in 1840, was dispersed among collectors and museums before systematic study could preserve its original arrangement. The Galloway Hoard, found in 2014, benefited from modern methods: three-dimensional recording, micro-excavation, isotopic analysis, yielding insights unavailable to earlier generations. Each new find refines our picture, adding nuance to what was once a broad narrative of Viking plunder and adventure. The objects themselves, cleaned of centuries of soil, reveal tool marks, wear patterns, and alloy compositions that speak of their manufacture and use. A bent arm ring carries the memory of the arm it once circled. A clipped coin bears the trace of the balance scale that measured its worth. Yet the deepest layer of meaning lies not in the metal, but in the absence that surrounds it. Every unrecovered hoard represents a story that ended without conclusion, a voyage not completed, a return not made, a name not passed down. The dark secrets they hide are not mysteries of the supernatural, but of the ordinary human condition. The planning that anticipates survival, the hope that outpaces fate, the finality that claims both the planner and the plan. In this way, the buried treasures of the Viking Age stand as quiet monuments to impermanence, preserving in their stillness the motion of lives that once crossed seas, clashed in battle, traded in distant markets, and ultimately entrusted their wealth to the ground with the belief that the future would honor that trust. The future, more often than not, did not. What remains is the metal, the memory of intent, and the enduring silence of earth that received what men and women could not carry forward. The narrative of these hoards, then, is less a chronicle of riches than a meditation on loss. They remind us that the Viking Age, for all its boldness and reach, was lived under the same shadow that falls across every era, the certainty that plans, however carefully laid, meet their limit in the unpredictability of human existence. The treasures buried and never reclaimed are not failures of caution, but testimonies to the weight of circumstance. They rest now in museum drawers and display cases, their journeys complete in a way their owners never intended, bearing witness across a millennium to the quiet, persistent truth that wealth, like life itself, is never fully secure.